Good morning and welcome to this special Thanksgiving Day edition of the Sunday History Rewind. I'm your host, Jim Lumley. In just a couple of days, millions of Americans around the United States of America will celebrate Thanksgiving. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to make this an official national holiday back during the Civil War in 1863, but the history of Thanksgiving goes way back to the year 1620 when hundreds of brave Europeans boarded a ship called the Mayflower in September, and they set sail for a new adventure in the New World. 102 of those passengers were what we call Pilgrims or Separatists, and they were fleeing religious persecution from the Anglican Church in England. Now, there are some myths about Thanksgiving, but there's also some truths that we need to remember. So we're going to feature 3 videos today. One is appropriate for children, explaining the history of Thanksgiving. It's an amazing story of a voyage that almost didn't make it. In fact, they were supposed to arrive at the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, but due to weather, they settled at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. And they formed our first government, and that agreement, signed by 41 men, was known as the Mayflower Compact. So take the voyage with me today as we look back at the history of the first Thanksgiving here on the Sunday History Rewind.
Even if you're not an American, you've probably heard of the holiday. But the image of pacifist settlers singing Kumbaya alongside the natives is all wrong. The story begins on a cold pier in England in August of 1620, when 120 men, women, and children stepped onto 2 English merchant ships in Southampton Harbor bound for the Americas. Both vessels seemed to be held together by spit and prayers. The Speedwell was so old it had fought against the Spanish Armada in 1588, and the Mayflower was such an ungainly transport ship that it could barely sail into the wind. And since the North Atlantic in the fall and winter is nothing but westerly winds, it was the absolute worst ship to try and attempt a crossing with. But somehow the Mayflower had made it to the Americas twice before, even if it had taken twice as long as normal. Luckily, these would-be colonists were determined. They had to be. They were Brownists, religious dissenters from the Anglican Church of England. You see, the Brownist beliefs were relatively simple. The first, that only the word of the Holy Bible was infallible. The second, that individual churches and their local communities should have more say and autonomy in the goings-on of the church. Both these beliefs were aimed at jettisoning the corrupt power structure of the old Catholicism. That didn't happen. As the new church started looking more Catholic by the day, the Brownists bought themselves a printing press and began passing out leaflets that opposed it, which led to the Brownists becoming intimately familiar with the inside of London's prison system. They got such a bad rap that Shakespeare even mentions them in one of his plays, Twelfth Night, where he says, "I had as gladly be a Brownist as a politician." Not exactly a flattering comparison. So the Pilgrims decided to risk it all as a startup colony in the Americas, creaky boat and all. It would be an English colony, but one not bound by religious politics. So they set sail and braved the rough fall seas in August of 1620. They hadn't even made it out of the port, though, before they found that the Speedwell was taking on water, so they pulled over in Dartmouth for repairs. Undaunted, they shored the leaking boards and set out again, to a new life, and watched with glee as Land's End and Cornwall slipped away behind them, only to turn around and immediately see it again. The Speedwell had recently been refitted with a larger mast, and somebody had clearly botched the job. The ship was going nowhere. So 20 people agreed to stay behind and bring more of their congregation with them the next year, and 102 crammed onto the already overloaded Mayflower, finally leaving again on the 6th of September. Or maybe it was the 16th, no one's actually sure, the calendars in that period are a bit wonky. Their trip was mercifully dull after recent events, but halfway across the ocean, the Pilgrims' good luck set back in again. A storm and strong winds hit. In the middle of the storm, a deep snap echoed through the ship. A main beam had cracked. So they pulled a spare from the hold and tried to reinforce it. But the buckling was so severe that it wouldn't stay in place. That meant it was time to turn around and go back to England. Again. The delays had already exhausted all the Pilgrims' money, and for them, that wasn't an option. So they decided to try something else first. They had brought a great iron screw with them as cargo, likely a piece of the exact printing press that had gotten them kicked out of England in the first place, and used that to raise the new beam into place. Somehow, it held long enough to get them across the Atlantic. They sighted land on 9th November, just off Cape Cod, then turned south for the Hudson River Valley, hoping to move closer to established colonies and warm weather. But hard winter currents forced them back to Massachusetts, where they set up anchor in the natural harbor of Provincetown. Knowing that their previous claim on this new land had been dodgy at best, the settlers agreed to draw up a new contract for their colony, styling it the Mayflower Compact. It organized them as a civil body politic created for the general good of the colony, where issues would be decided by vote. This set of rules and beliefs set down by the Pilgrims has since been called the world's first written constitution. The men of the ship put their names to paper, and they all signed the agreement together. And within weeks, they would all begin dying together. Scurvy and illness took hold of the boat, and as the first snows arrived, it turned the ship into an icy tomb. Exploration parties were sent out to find a suitable place to build, and any man who could still stand was put aboard with swords, armor, and matchlocks. They found a deserted landscape and found themselves strangers in an unknown land, filled with native burials and abandoned villages. But everywhere they went, eyes watched them. Going as far as they could each day, they camped on the shores, and in the dim morning, they draped their jackets over a barricade to dry, and made to move their boats back into the water. And that's when the arrows began to rain down on them. Grabbing muskets, they fired blindly into the forest. Their leader appeared from behind a tree and fired 3 arrows directly at the Pilgrims. The man gave a triumphant cry and then disappeared again into the forest. The Pilgrims searched the area, but found no bodies. Only 18 arrows, tipped with deer horn, brass, and eagle's claws. When they went to retrieve their jackets, they found them riddled with arrow holes. Guessing that as many as 30 or 40 men waited for them in the forest, the Pilgrims left before they could return. The next day, they found the building place they were looking for, well suited to winter construction, already cleared of timber, with tall hills for defensive positions. But it was also full of dead bodies. Patuxet had been a village of the Wampanoag people, until it had been wiped out by an outbreak of Indian fever 3 years earlier. The epidemic was bad enough that the colonists found unburied skeletons still inside their homes. But with more settlers dying by the second, the Pilgrims were in no shape to be picky. They moved the Mayflower to join them and began construction. The first common house that was finished became a hospital for the ill, and the 19 families then each built their own town, huddled together for defense, and by February, the settlement was complete. But without food or proper shelter, they continued to die off one by one by one. And by the time the snows thawed, only 47 of the original 102 Pilgrims were still alive, and half of the Mayflower crew had died as well. Those that survived now faced the danger of summer raiding parties, so they decided to fortify the village, bringing cannons from the ship to point outwards into the unknown wilds. Finally free of the bitter cold, they planted corn taken from the abandoned graves and storehouses of the old Wampanoag village. And with that first thaw came their first contact with the locals. A man, tall and dark-skinned, boldly strode out of the forest and made to walk directly into the center of their town. The Pilgrims stopped him, guns pointed. Then he opened his mouth and greeted them in English, welcoming them to the new land, and then promptly asked for a beer to drink. He was Samoset of the eastern Abenaki, who'd spent years trading tales and supplies with English fishermen who passed through the area. And as he swapped stories over his acquired taste for English delicacies, he warned that not every tribe would be as friendly as his, but they could get little more out of him as his English was broken at best. The next week, Samoset returned with a new man, Tisquantum, known today as Squanto, who spoke fluent English. He was the last survivor of the Patuxet tribe, the very land the Pilgrims now inhabited, who had been taken by slavers as a boy and had lived in Spain and England before escaping back home again, only to find his own people had been wiped out by disease. He had been taken captive, a useful tool to deal with the continuing English encroachment. Squanto heralded the arrival of 60 armed warriors and their chief. the Wampanoag. The Pilgrims grabbed their muskets and ran to the walls and waited for the worst. But neither side wanted to make the first move. With a bit of back and forth from Squanto, their chief, Massasoit, agreed to sit down with the Pilgrims' governor, and after a healthy amount of liquor to loosen up both sides, they set about with the business of peace. See, the Wampanoag found themselves beset on all sides by enemy tribes, with plenty of land, but no power to hold them back. Where others saw the English settlers as a threat, Massasoit saw an opportunity. The Pilgrims agreed to help the chief against his enemies by using their muskets and cannons, in return for mutual protection, and some much-needed agricultural advice from Squanto, specifically how to plant the native foods that the Pilgrims had never before encountered. And so began an unlikely friendship, where Squanto passed on his knowledge of the land. Under his tutelage, the Pilgrims learned how to plant corn, bean, and squash in a way that ensured that each would thrive. When they weren't planting, they sent diplomatic parties out to every tribe in a 50-mile radius to agree to mutual peace, and took time to knock the heads of anyone who threatened their native allies. So by the time the fall came and the harvest ready to be brought in, they found themselves looking quite optimistically to the new year, especially in comparison to the last. It was in this spirit that the men were sent into the forest to shoot a few game birds, likely turkeys and waterfowl, for a feast to give thanks to the Lord for their bounty and good luck. Massasoit joined them with 90 of his people and brought along 5 deer for the occasion. Add to that a few eels, some fish, crabs, and a lobster or two, and of course their freshly harvested corns, beans, and squash, and you got yourself the first Thanksgiving dinner. It was a celebration that lasted for 3 days, a harvest festival with sport, games, and friends, like so many others around the world. Days of Thanksgiving, thankful that there will be enough food to eat, and another year survived. Sure, the new land wasn't perfect. It wasn't harmony between man and beast, or a permanent peace between settler and native. But for a time, people set aside their differences and gave their thanks for a chance at life. And many other harvest festivals appear around the world today for just the same thing. And that's the story of the first Thanksgiving.
Historian author Kenneth C. Davis knows the real story. Hello, Kenneth C. Davis.
Good morning, Gail.
Okay, so Ken, this is the thing. We're taught in school that the Pilgrims came to this country in search of religious freedom. You said that that's only half of the story and that not everybody on board the Mayflower were Pilgrims.
That's correct. About half of the passengers on the Mayflower what we would call Pilgrims, the people coming because they were trying to escape the Church of England and persecution. The other half were people coming for the same reason immigrants have come for hundreds of years: opportunity, land, and a chance to have a life in this new world. That's one of the reasons when they got to Provincetown, that's where they landed first, the tip of Cape Cod, they had to decide who was going to be in charge because they were going to go their separate ways, and that's why they sat down and decided to write this thing called the Mayflower Compact, the first real constitution in American history. And they said they were going to rule themselves with a vote. Of course, the women weren't included.
How many people who came aboard, how many did you say, it was 100?
It was about 100 passengers.
Yeah.
Who survived the trip. One child born on the trip named Oceanus.
Yes.
And
when did they begin celebrating Thanksgiving?
well, what we think of as the first Thanksgiving, this is where the legend and the myth gets layered on. October 1621 is the first feast to celebrate a harvest. They didn't call it Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving to them would have meant a day of prayer and fasting, not what most of us have in mind for this Thursday.
Not at all. What did they serve?
Well, they did have turkey, but wild turkey, not the butterball we're talking about right now. But a lot more seafood, obviously. They were camped out next to the Atlantic Ocean. So there was cod. There was eel. Eel is a great protein.
Oh, I love eel, don't you?
No.
Isn't it on your menu for Thursday?
Not even kinda.
No, and Squanto, this famous Indian who could speak English, imagine that, taught them how to catch eel, also to...
Wait, Squanto could speak English?
That's right. When the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, they are there for a few months, and one day somebody walks into their camp, a kind of bedraggled Native American, and speaks English. And he comes back a few days later and brings another man named, we call him Squanto. That was probably not his real name or his native name. He could speak English. They had met European sailors, English sailors, for many years. This is part of the myth also. Sailors had been up and down these coasts for a long time looking for cod.
Right.
And Squanto had actually been taken prisoner on board a ship, been forced into slavery, first in Spain and later in England, finally gets his way back. It's an extraordinary story, but speaks English perfectly.
But Ken, you've got a lot of myths and misconceptions this morning, including, you know, we always think about what they wear, black clothes, black hats, silver buckles on their shoes. You're saying even that's not true. That's
not true, because they were
You're
simple.
just here to break myths this morning. Is that what you're doing?
I'm bursting all those Thanksgiving parade
There you
balloons
go.
this morning. They wore the simple clothes of English farmers. The picture with the black and the black hats is really an idealized vision of the Puritans who come a little bit later. And that's a kind of 19th century Victorian America idealized vision. They tote their guns and go off to church. And that's another thing. Thanksgiving would have meant probably 3 hours in church. Those Puritans were festive people.
Let me talk about American presidents. 7 presidents declare lineage back to the Mayflower, correct?
7 or 8, including obviously the
John
Adamses,
Adams, right.
John Adams and John Quincy Adams, born in Massachusetts. They're very near descendants.
And what's Lincoln's connection to Thanksgiving?
Lincoln's connection is that he creates the first Thanksgiving presidential proclamation, placing Thanksgiving on the last Thursday in November. And it had nothing to do with the Puritans or the Pilgrims. He had very little to be thankful for.
And Roosevelt?
Roosevelt moved the traditional Thanksgiving date in 1939 because of the Depression. Right. Retailers said, move it up a week, we need more time for shopping. That was happening back then. There was a lot of controversy over it. They called it Franksgiving. There were 2 Thanksgivings that year. In 1941, Congress sets the date as the 4th Thursday in November, which is where it is today.
To most Americans, the Pilgrims of Plymouth, Massachusetts are the iconic inspiration for today's Thanksgiving feast. After the winter of 1620 killed almost half of their people, the colonists formed a relationship with the neighboring Wampanoag tribe, who taught them about fishing, planting, and hunting. By autumn of 1621, the colonists had collected enough food to feed the community through the coming winter. The Wampanoags joined the colonists for a 3-day feast in honor of their bounty. The feast probably did not include our modern Thanksgiving staple, turkey. More likely, the colonists and Wampanoags dined on roast goose, along with corn, codfish, and lobster. This 1621 harvest meal is now commonly thought of as the first Thanksgiving. Yet for later generations of colonists, New England days of Thanksgiving had little to do with the 1621 harvest festival. Theirs was a religious holiday, descended from Puritan days of fasting, prayer, and giving thanks to God. Every autumn, the governor of each colony would declare days of thanksgiving for bountiful harvests, victorious battles, or drought-ending rains. In 1777, the Continental Congress decreed that all 13 of America's colonies celebrate a national day of Thanksgiving that year in celebration of their victory over the British at Saratoga. By the mid-19th century, many states celebrated the holiday. However, the date could vary by weeks or even months. A determined magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hale set about establishing a national Thanksgiving Day. She passionately believed that such a day would help unite a nation headed towards civil war. Hale began a one-woman letter-writing campaign, urging politicians to establish an annual day of Thanksgiving. Her efforts were finally rewarded by Abraham Lincoln, who saw the unifying potential of the holiday. In 1863, 4 months after the victory at Gettysburg, he declared the last Thursday of November to be Thanksgiving Day. By the 20th century, Thanksgiving was a welcome day of leisure from a 6-day work week. In the 1920s, the National Football League was formed. In an effort to boost attendance, the fledgling Detroit Lions devised the concept of a Thanksgiving Day game. Parades also became a Turkey Day tradition, and department stores quickly saw their value as a kickoff to the Christmas shopping season. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade began in 1924, and year after year, millions of New Yorkers braved the cold to watch the festivities. Most of all, Thanksgiving is about family. With modern life moving faster than ever, Thanksgiving gives us a day to take a collective breath, reconnect with loved ones, and remember just how much we have to be thankful for.
Here's the turkey!